Hi, and welcome back to Nevaeh's Nightmare. And on this episode, we are going to be talking about Whitley Strieber and the Communion. Whitley Strieber was spending time in his cabin in upstate New York with his family over the Christmas holiday in 1985. The day after Christmas was just like any other day at the cabin, but that night, Strieber had a terrifying and horrifying experience that shook him to his core and sent his life both personally and professionally in another direction. Whitley Strieber had already established himself as a horror writer, with two of his novels, Wolven and The Hunger, that had been made into feature films in the early 1980s. Both of these novels worked with the concept of beings that came out of the shadow world and preyed on humans, such as werewolves and vampires. Right before the event had occurred, in December 1985, Whitley was also working on novels dealing with nuclear war and ecological disaster. The Striebers owned a cabin in upstate New York where they would go to escape the craziness of their life in New York City. In December of 1985, Whitley and his wife Anne and their son went to the cabin to spend time for over the holiday season. They spent the day of December 26th skiing and they were exhausted when they returned home. The family retired to bed early and nothing seemed out of the ordinary in the cabin. Later that night, Whitley woke up in bed and noticed something moving the bedroom door open. He looked and saw a small figure looking at him standing in the doorway. He later described the figure as compact and wearing a small brimmed hat. As he was watching the figure in the doorway, it rushed at him and put some kind of device up to his head. The next thing Whitley remembered, he was floating outside of his room and outside of the cabin, all while feeling little tiny arms lifting him up. The next thing he remembered was being outside with a whole group of these little entities. He made sure all the while trying to record everything that he could see around him so he could describe it later. He encountered different kinds of beings other than the typical greys. Some were even short and stocky and resembled trolls. He was taken to one of the beings and he felt that this was the one that was in charge. Although he couldn't really tell by the sight, he intuitively knew that the being was female. He also felt that she was wearing some sort of face mask, and he was then taken up in the air into a round room. Once there, the beings performed several procedures that were very invasive, and at one point, Whitley even became angry at the beings, and the woman came to him to calm him down, speaking in an electronic, almost Midwestern accent. Something was then placed on his head, and the next thing he knew, he had woken up in his bed. Upon awakening, all he remembered was seeing a barn owl looking at him through the window in the middle of the night. He even told his wife Anne that he had seen the owl, but when he looked outside, he didn't see any tracks at all. Later that day, some neighbors stopped by the cabin, and Whitley told them that he had seen a bright light in the woods the night before. The neighbors told him that they had not seen the light, and later that day, the family went skiing, but had to cut it short because Whitley was exhausted and had to go home and just get some sleep. For the next week, Whitley had experienced an extreme amount of physical pain and had become prone to fits of anger. This concerned Anne because 2 months previously, Whitley had exhibited the same behavior, but things to have seemed to be getting better. About a week later, Anne noticed a spot on the back of Whitley's head next to his ear. As the couple looked at it, memories began to flood back to Whitley about what had happened a few days before, but also another incident that had happened in October. He knew he had not just seen an owl outside of his window. On October 4th, 1985, Whitley and his family were joined by two of their friends for a trip to the cabin for the weekend. After a long day of traveling, everyone retired to bed early. After a few hours, Whitley woke up and saw a bluish light moving across the ceiling, and he felt as if the roof was on fire. Instead of immediately waking up, he fell asleep again. He was awoken by a large bang that startled him and everyone else awake. He rushed downstairs in a panic, believing the entire house was on fire, but found out there was nothing, and everyone just went back to sleep. After this event, Whitley had a memory of light that enveloped the whole cabin and a strange memory of a large, brightly lit crystal that hovered overhead. He also had a memory of a light flashing in his eyes during the night and an explosion. He also became agitated and constantly checked the doors to see if they were locked, repeatedly fearing that prowlers were coming into the cabin at night. Whitley felt like he was going insane and wondered if he had some type of physical disease. He actually went out and tested for a temporal lobe epilepsy, but the tests were negative for any kind of physical condition. Because of these two events and disturbing memories, Whitley made contact with Bud Hopkins. He was barely aware of Hopkins' research into alien abduction, but he heard him and felt that Bud Hopkins' work matched somewhat of his own experiences. Hopkins hypnotized Whitley, and more memories came flooding back. Hopkins also told Whitley that he should ask his wife and son what they remembered about those two nights. Whitley was shocked when his son mentioned the night of October 4th that he and the others were worried about Whitley. When he asked who the others were, his son responded, "The little people that were there." Whitley relayed this to Bud Hopkins and told him to ask his son about dreams and not memories. When he asked his son about his dreams on the night in question, he told his father that he remembered being outside with these little doctors. Whitley really wanted to find out what had happened the night of October 4th, so he had Bud perform a hypnotic regression. Under hypnosis, Whitley described encountering a small hooded figure with large slanted eyes standing in front of the bed as a bright light flooded through the window. The figure was carrying something that looked like a ruler that was placed on Whitley's head. When the being did this, a vision of a nuclear explosion flashed into Whitley's mind, and he heard a voice say, "This is what will happen to your world." Whitley, might I add, had been working on a book about nuclear war called War Day. The figure then pulled out another device that produced a loud bang that woke everyone in the cabin up. After these sessions, Whitley was now convinced that he had encountered with non-human entities. More memories came back to him about the events that had happened on other occasions more than just the two incidents in 1985. He discovered that these beings that he began to call the visitors had been coming to him for most of his life. Whitley was not convinced that the visitors were from outer space. Instead, he felt they were beings that had always existed on Earth right beside humans. In a sense, they were similar to being described in fairy folklore and ancient mythology. Whitley felt that the purpose of the visitors was to come in contact with human beings and to have some kind of interaction with them while they achieved their unclear goals. The word for the interaction between the visitors and the humans that came to mind was the word communion, which became the title of the book about his encounters. Communion was published in 1987 and became an instant bestseller. It featured a striking front cover by artist Ted Smith Jacobs depicting the female visitor that Whitley had encountered again and again. Many critics did not know what to make of the book. Whitley had been a horror writer, and they felt that he just made up another story, calling it nonfiction. For many people, however, the book struck a chord. Others came forward to speak about their experiences, and Whitley received thousands of letters detailing alien abduction encounters. Communion was also made into a feature film starring Christopher Walken in 1989. After Communion and Bud Hopkins' Intruders, the media became interested in the subject as well as Whitley as being a guest on quite a few talk shows over the next few years. He even started his own show called Unknown Country that he still produces to this day. What can be said about Strieber's experiences and his book about them? Some have looked at Strieber as being something of an opportunist, stating that his last few books have not sold all that well and he needed something to revive his career, and he had become aware of Hopkins' work and he chose to write a work of fiction posing as a real account. Others feel that Whitley had a real encounter and was truly left him shaken up, and that the best therapy was to write the account of it. Strieber has never wavered his account and has added much to it over the years, and many other books detailing more of his encounters with the visitors. Whatever the case may be, Whitley helped bring the alien gray into the mainstream and set the stage of exploration of the alien abduction phenomena that would explode in the 1990s. Thank you so much for watching this episode. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, share, and let me know how you thought about Whitley Strieber and the Communion. Would you read his book or watch any of the movies? You got it? Did you? Okay, sorry. You normally do like 3, 2, and then like you didn't do the hand thing, and I was like, okay, weird.